I think the Future Minerals Forum has been a very significant development in the last few years. Certainly, I myself was not previously aware of both Saudi Arabia's own very significant mineral resources, but also about its initiative to really bring the world together to look at how we can build better global supply chains in the worlds of mining. And so I was very honoured and delighted to be invited to the Future Minerals Forum in January this year. And to be honest, I was absolutely amazed by it. I had perhaps a lot of preconceptions before I went, and it was a very, very impressive meeting. And that was for several reasons. So one was the sheer scale of the event. I think there was something like over 14,000 participants there. It was like a who's who from the world of mining. But also the interface, both of the conference itself, very powerful, very interesting expo and discussions, and obviously excellent to meet so many people from across the world. I was one of the two co-moderators, along with Sheila Kama, for the Ministerial Roundtable. This took place before the main conference, and it was a very powerful and very important meeting. It involved some 74 countries and 35 international organisations, and convened by the Minister for Saudi Arabia. And what was important about it was these were not just set-piece statements, as one often sees at these big roundtable meetings. There was some extent of that, of different countries, obviously showcasing what they believed they had to offer. But really, this was about a regional endeavour. It was about Saudi Arabia building links across Africa, across Central and South Asia, looking at its positioning in the region, but also how both Saudi Arabia could be a hub in terms of critical minerals, but also how it could help with investment and partnership in galvanising relations across the region in this very important world of mining. And why is mining so important, and why do we need to come together in these both regional and global forums? And that's really because we need more mining. And that's perhaps a difficult message in our world, but also mining itself is changing. So to explain a bit more about that, we're all aware of climate change, the growing crisis for our world. Sadly, many people, many countries are feeling more and more devastating impacts from climate change. And we know from the science that that's going to get worse. So I was involved in COP26, the big UN climate conference that the UK hosted in Glasgow, and I was the regional ambassador working with countries across Latin America and the Caribbean. And at COP26 in Glasgow, so that was 3 years ago in 2021, the world recognised the importance of committing to net zero by 2050, and in turn that means radically cutting greenhouse emissions by 2030. And so related to that is the energy transition, the key thing that will make those greenhouse gas emissions reduce. And that's about things like moving to electric vehicles, moving to more renewable sources of energy, etc. But to do all of that, and also to keep industrialised economies growing, and for countries across the world to benefit more, we need more materials to make all that happen. And that means more mining. And so a big challenge is about how you both have more mining, but how that is done in a responsible way, how it's done in a way that benefits and partners with communities, and how it ensures that the environment and nature, biodiversity are also protected. And so what was very interesting about the conference in Saudi Arabia was developing those conversations both in country but also with other countries in the region. the meeting was also focused on actions and some practical measures that can help, particularly around science and technology. And so, for example, building a network of centres of excellence, because both the science and innovation that is needed to make all this happen needs a global collaboration. And also, we need to train more people. Capacity building in these areas is also very, very important. So overall, it was important meeting at the Future Minerals Forum, where countries came together to discuss these challenges of building responsible supply chains, of ensuring benefits locally to communities and economic growth, particularly in the countries that are holding the mineral reserves, and then also about how you can build collaborations across the region, for example, through these centres of excellence. So what was also very powerful about the meeting in Riyadh in January was Saudi Arabia really showing how it wants to build partnership opportunities, how it wants to facilitate investment, both in terms of Saudi Arabia's own very extensive mineral resources, which I think new surveys have revealed even more than was originally anticipated. But looking again at investment and how investment can be in partnership with different countries, particularly across the local region. And doing this in a way that both brings value in the countries. So I think what's also very important is it's not just about the extraction side of things. There is also very important support and investment needed for the surveying and exploration. There's then about the extraction side of things, and there's then about the processing and about then downstream manufacturing. And so discussions are ongoing with both within Saudi Arabia and I believe across the region to look at how this investment can best be deployed, how those partnerships can be facilitated. So I think the very positive messaging that was given at the conference was a very important part of building those potential partnerships. So it's been very interesting to see more reach out from Saudi Arabia to Latin America. Traditionally, I believe, a part of the world where there has not been close relations. But in this last year, we've seen a number of interesting initiatives by Saudi Arabia. First of all, not long after the Future Minerals Forum in Riyadh in January, in February, there was an important investment summit, I think it's called the F2 Investment Summit in Miami. Now, obviously, that's a big interface also with Latin America, and in which there were some discussions. Then in June, there was a further edition of the F2 Summit in Rio, involving many players from Latin America. And also I understand that the ministry has been on visits to countries in South America, reaching out, looking at potential investment opportunities. So why is this happening? Why is it significant? So in addressing this huge scale-up that are needed of mining and mineral resources, many of the world's reserves are actually held in Latin America. And Latin America, many countries such as Chile, Brazil, Peru, Colombia, etc., have a strong tradition of mining. But still, there are more and more potential reserves there. So Latin America has many of the resources that the world is going to need to expand mining and to address the climate crisis. So Latin America, and we shouldn't really talk about a collective region because each of the countries are, of course, very distinctive, but that part of the world is very important. So it's been interesting to see Saudi Arabia reach out, and not just in terms of mining, but also looking at partnership opportunities in renewable energies and in infrastructure and in technology. And then also, I think more generally, there's been links discussed also on the food security side, because obviously food commodities, Latin America is a great producer an exporter, which could also be of interest to Saudi Arabia. So what we've also seen in the last couple of years is countries around the world, particularly the industrialised nations, drawing up critical mineral strategies and looking at the supply chains and realising that Latin America holds the key to many of those supply chains. So, for example, Latin America produces something like 40% of the world's copper, currently about 35% of the world's lithium. But it holds significantly more resources of copper. It holds nearly 50% of global reserves of lithium. On nickel, for example, Latin America currently produces about 20% of global supply, but holds 25% of the reserves. On graphite, current production about 8%, future global reserves around 20%. So I've talked about the critical mineral strategies of different countries around the world, and Latin America holds most of the minerals that are on those lists for the industrialised countries. And not only does it have nearly all those minerals, but it has huge reserves. So mining is already a very, very important part of different economies in Latin America, for example, in Brazil, Chile, Peru, Colombia. There is enormous potential. Currently, around 40% of the world's production of copper comes from Latin America, primarily from Chile. 27% alone is from Chile. But on lithium, for example, around 35% of current production, but 50% of the world's reserves are in the region. For example, Brazil alone holds around 20% of global reserves of key minerals such as nickel, graphite, manganese, and many of the rare earths. For a lot of these energy transition applications, you actually need quite small amounts of these materials, but what you need is very, very important. Another interesting aspect about critical minerals, and again why all this is so important, and particularly in relation to Latin America, is we suddenly need different combinations and different proportions of these critical minerals to those that we're used to extracting for large-scale industrial processes. And having said all that, as well as critical minerals needed for the energy transition, industrialised economies, which are in themselves heavily dependent on mining and materials, still need to keep going. So the scale-up that is needed across the world to extract the materials necessary for future economic growth and for the energy transition to address the climate crisis is enormous. And this brings out new challenges and also new opportunities for partnerships and for businesses. And some of the challenges are around the sheer timescales involved. And so this is urgent, and this is something I feel that we often forget. We have all these great commitments made towards net zero for 2050. As I've said, that needs radical action by 2030. That's only less than 6 years away. But mining takes a long time. The average time to go from exploration to production can be around 16 years. That's quite common. So how do you speed up that process to get a mine into operation faster? But how do you do it in a way that ensures rigorous adherence to community engagement and partnership, and also environmental protection? And this is a very big challenge that people around the world are talking about. How do you do this? And there are no easy answers. And again, that's been part of the discussions which Saudi Arabia has been taking forward in the Future Minerals Forum. As I've said, Latin America has enormous potential to help provide what the world needs on critical minerals. But there are big gaps. There is a big gap between the volume of supply that is needed in the timescale that it's needed. So closing that gap is very important. There's a huge gap between what the world needs and the timescale in which the mining world can produce what's needed. This varies between the different minerals, but it's clear that there are big supply gaps. So there are the challenges of, first of all, discovery. Across much of Latin America, it's actually unsurveyed territory, so there could well be more reserves than those I've already described. So there's surveying, there's exploration to actually assess the economic value of particular deposits. Then there's how you get a mine into production, the actual extraction side of things. And then it's not enough just to get it out of the ground. It's about the processing side and then adding value in downstream manufacturing. Now, what's very interesting is also the dimension of China in this picture. So China has grown its links with Latin America over many years, and a vast proportion, something like 70% of the minerals extracted, go to China for processing. So there is a dynamic there that obviously is very important to the economies of Latin America, but there is also a dynamic then with the West versus China, particularly the whole US dimension, of course. But fundamentally, whoever is buying these minerals, another gap is the value being added back into Latin America. And this is a long historic challenge where traditionally the minerals are extracted from Latin America, but there is relatively little in-country processing and even less in-country downstream manufacturing. So as we progress through the energy transition, that's going to be very important. And in turn, Latin America has other dynamics that play into this. So one is its huge actual renewable energy resources. So wind, solar, hydro, for example. Hydrogen energy is another very, very important area that is being actively developed in Latin America. And so one of the challenges in building partnerships is to make sure it's a real partnership, that this isn't just about minerals being extracted and exported, but how countries in the West, countries such as Saudi Arabia that wish to build partnerships, how this is done in a way which brings benefit to Latin America, to the communities and to wider economic growth and social development in the countries concerned. So de-risking, we talk about that in terms of supply chains and processing capacity. Another area of risk to think about is that parts of Latin America, Africa, other parts of the world that are very rich in mineral resources are themselves very vulnerable to climate change. So you have a real issue in supply chains, both in terms of the market dynamics of supply, but also in terms of the stability of the countries, which could be political stability, but it's more likely to be climate-related facility. And of course, mining by its very nature, these deposits are often in remote, inaccessible places where perhaps they themselves could be vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, big climate disasters such as flooding, for example. And so how you make mining resilient, how you make the infrastructure resilient, is also an important part of this equation. Ultimately, what is this all about? It's all about people. Why are we worrying about this? It's because our world is changing. And so it's how we ensure we address the climate crisis, secure people's livelihoods, secure people's quality of life, and ultimately people's lives. And so if we're going to do that through more mining, people has to be at the heart of that. Now, traditionally, mining, of course, has a very negative image. Perhaps not many of us actually think about how the lives we lead, how much it depends on mining, but it certainly does. But if we're going to need more of it, mining also has a difficult history, and let's be honest about that. And there have been some very difficult examples in Latin America. For example, the tailings dam disasters that were in Brazil. We've just seen huge social protests in Panama over copper mining. So there is a whole issue of trust and building public understanding of mining and understanding how mining can go forward in a responsible way that brings benefits to communities. And so that's also very interesting in the approach that's been taken in Saudi Arabia and, for example, the discussions at the Ministerial Round Table that very much focused on responsible and resilient mining. So we have to be realistic about the problems that have occurred in the past and about how we build trust. So, but there are many practical examples, not least in Latin America, about how this can develop going forward. And ultimately, it's about partnerships that has to be between government, business, and communities. And so, for example, in Chile, the issue of community relations, of environmental protection is absolutely crucial and embedded in the national strategy. Key mining companies in Chile, for example, Antofagasta, Anglo-American, Rio Tinto, this is at the heart of how they operate their mining production facilities. Another example is a company to which I'm an advisor, Appian. Appian have invested in 5 major projects in Brazil. And working both with the local authorities but also communities, there are many initiatives that have been taken. So, for example, local hiring so that jobs go back to that community. Looking at nature regeneration, how can there be investment in bringing back nature? Looking in the longer term, what can happen once a mine closes, because mines have a finite lifetime. So how can companies invest back in regeneration of the land once the mine has closed? That's another aspect that's very important. So there are many initiatives that can be taken. So, for example, some of the initiatives taken by Appian, for example, with its company Atlantic Nickel, have involved regeneration, planting seedlings for reforestation, involved development of a water treatment plant, working with communities, particularly on issues that address marginalised communities, healthcare initiatives, education initiatives. So there are a huge range of things that companies can do that actually bring benefit back to the communities where these mineral reserves are held. Looking ahead to the Future Minerals Forum for 2025, it's been good to see the planning that is already developing, very much focusing on moving from discussion to action. Because the urgency of this agenda is really upon us. And that's where I think initiatives such as the Future Minerals Forum play such a valuable role in bringing countries together, in really focusing on what needs to happen next, and focusing very much on practical measures to build collaboration, to build partnership, to develop skills, share technology, and ultimately look at how the world of mining can benefit our world of the future.